Hey guys, this is Mr. Champlin. Today we're going to be talking about fish. So we're going to, for the rest of the year, we're going to be talking about the vertebrates. So just to remind you, what is a vertebrate? A vertebrate is an animal with a backbone. So that includes fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. So we're going to start with fish. So first of all, a lot of this will be kind of pretty basic. A lot of the stuff you guys kind of already know. So we're just going to go over this really quickly. But as you know, all fish are aquatic. That is to say they live in water. So nothing surprising there. It can be freshwater or saltwater, of course. They are vertebrates. So we already mentioned we're talking about vertebrates. So they do have a backbone. They have paired fins. Again, this is probably not a surprise to you. So many of the fins, like the pectoral fin here and the pelvic fin here, they are paired, right? And of course, this is actually where our arms and legs evolved from. Most fish have scales, not all of them, but the vast majority of the fish have scales. So these are just general characteristics that most fish have. So a little bit about fish evolution. Where did fish come from? Well, fish evolved from the invertebrates, so they probably evolved from some worm-like ancestor, and then later on they evolved to be much bigger, and they would have had bony plates, and so they were heavily armored. So here's a drawing of a fish based on the fossils that have been found. And you can see that it has these kind of like plates, and it's got this sort of helmet-like apparatus. These are actually made of bone, so they're actually almost like in large scale. So this, looks almost like a knight in armor might look. So it's got this really heavy, bony, protective covering. And also, the early fish were actually jawless. And as we'll talk about, some of them still are. But the vast majority now have jaws. So by jawless, we mean what? So jawless, they have a mouth. There's an opening there. There is also probably teeth. But they have no lower jaw. So they can't do that kind of, snapping motion that like an alligator or a shark might do. So during the Devonian period, which was a long time ago, millions and millions of years ago, fish ruled the oceans. In fact, they essentially ruled the world because they evolved before mammals and birds and reptiles and amphibians. So there's a time when there was no vertebrates living on land, or in the ocean, the only vertebrates that existed were fish. And so this period, the Devonian period, this period of time is sort of known as the period of time when fish ruled the world, because essentially, as far as vertebrates go, that's all there was. Later on, of course, fish evolved jaws, and you see here this fish, it has a lower jaw, and that gave it a huge advantage because they're able to grab onto food. And then, of course, later on we had these paired fins. Again, as we'll mention in more detail later, gave the fish more maneuverability and a better ability to swim. So here we see a fish, and we see all the fins of the fish here. So the dorsal fin, which is found at the top of the body near the backbone, and some fish actually have a second dorsal fin. Not all of them, but some of them do. Then you have the caudal fin, which is the fancy name for the tail fin. You have the pelvic fins down here, which is where the legs would be if fish had legs, which of course they don't have. You have the anal fin, which is near the anus, so the anus would be right here. And this is the pectoral fin. So as the name suggests, your pecs are in your chest, and those are attached to your arms. So that's where the arms of the fish would be if they had arms. So again, some of these are paired fins, some of them are not, but all these fins give the fish lots of maneuverability in the water. And the water, much like an airplane is able to move through the air because of all of these different projections that can move. Oops, sorry. They would filter the microscopic algae from the water, and then some of them might eat larger plant-like algae. There are, of course, parasites. There are plenty of parasites. And there are detritivores. So these would be fish that would just eat junk off the bottom of the ocean, dead stuff. Now, their digestive system goes mouth, esophagus, stomach, much the same as you or I. Then, of course, they have this, pyloric ceca, which we don't have. And this pyloric ceca is an organ that helps to produce digestive enzymes. And then the intestine, of course, comes next. We have one of those, and then the anus. So not that different from our digestive system. And, of course, it will vary depending on what types of foods they eat. So, again, this, pyloric ceca, its job is to secrete digestive enzymes to help, digest the food. The intestine, it does what all intestines do, and that is, of course, lots of digestion does occur in the intestine. In fact, more happens in the intestine than the stomach, which is something a lot of people don't know. But another important thing would be absorption. So once you digest the food, you have to absorb it into the body, and it has to enter the bloodstream. And in the intestine, this is where that happens. The liver and the pancreas, which have other functions also besides this, but they will also produce and release, digestive enzymes. They do other things also. So here's just kind of just a basic sort of overall overarching look at the anatomy of the fish. So of course they have a brain. It's not that large, but they have a brain. Here's of course the spine and the spinal cord, the gills. Here's the digestive system. So you see the liver and you see the stomach and the intestines. The gonads. This is where the eggs and sperm would be produced. This is the pyloric ceca. So again, this is for producing digestive enzymes. And then the swim bladder. So we'll talk about that. So this balloon-like organ that's inside the fish, and what that does. Of course, if you have gone fishing and you've caught fish and you've cleaned the fish, of course you can see all of these major organs inside. So as far as respiration goes, or breathing, as you probably already know, most fish use gills. And so here are the gills once they've been extracted from the fish. Here's one of the gills inside the fish. And you can see they're very red, and that makes sense. They have lots of blood in them. And these white things here would be the gill arches, which are structures that just kind of give the gills support. And gills have this kind of feathery texture that works well in water, but not on land. And that's why fish can't breathe very well out of water, and they will eventually suffocate. Here we see a bony fish with an operculum, which is this bony plate that sort of covers the gills and protects them. In other fish, like sharks, they don't have that bony plate, but they do have a number of gill slits that enables the water to sort of pass through. So this operculum, you've seen it working really hard when you look at goldfish, and they make that sort of characteristic, goldfish face. What they're doing is they're actually pumping water in through the mouth and then out through the operculum, and in this way they are essentially pumping water over those gills so they can extract oxygen. Now, many of you probably already know this, but sharks and their relatives, they don't have the ability to pump water over their gills using the operculum and their mouth muscles. So instead, most sharks and their relatives have to be constantly moving, and that constant movement allows the water to enter their mouth and then go out through the gill slits and pass over the gills. So kind of you may have heard that for many sharks, if they are not swimming, if they stop, they will actually suffocate. In fact, if you watch these on Shark Week, when they capture these sharks, just like a human, if you're having surgery, they would hook you up to a respirator to help you breathe during surgery. What they do with the sharks is they actually take a gigantic hose the size of a fire hose and just put it in the shark's mouth and just pump seawater through it so it goes in the mouth and then out over the gills, just to kind of help it to breathe while it's out of the water. Sorry. It comes in through the atrium, and the atrium is kind of like where the blood just kind of like sits, and it gently gets pumped into the ventricle. The ventricle, though, is really where most of the pumping happens, and you'll see that the walls of the ventricle are much thicker and much stronger. So it will pump the blood. The blood will go to the gills and then to the rest of the body and then come back into the heart again. So again, a single loop system. So you'll see that with birds and amphibians and reptiles and mammals, it's quite a bit different. But a single loop system, just think of it as just one big loop. The blood, travels into the heart, gets pumped, to the gills, and then from there to the rest of the body. Single loop system. Excretion. So again, we always talk about excretion. How do the organisms get rid of their waste products? How do they get rid of this nitrogenous waste? Now, fish they get rid of their nitrogenous waste as ammonia. Now, ammonia is quite toxic. In fact, what do we use ammonia for? Well, we use it to clean things. Well, why do we use it for that? Because it kills bacteria, it destroys viruses, it essentially damages, living tissue. So it's very toxic. But it's not a big deal for the fish because the fish, they essentially live in a giant toilet. They can be constantly getting rid of this high ammonia urine, and that works just fine. So it's not like us where we're keeping the urine in our urinary bladder for long periods of time and then releasing it a few times per day. In the fish, this ammonia-rich urine would constantly be leaving their bodies. So fish do have kidneys, and the kidneys are in charge of sort of filtering out the blood of this nitrogenous waste, and also they're of course in charge of controlling how much water is in the fish's body. So just like you and I, if we were to drink too much water, of course we would just pee it out again, and it would be very clear urine. Whereas if you don't drink for a long period of time, it would come out really dark because your body's trying to conserve water. Now, not only can fish pee out their urine, they can also excrete a lot of this nitrogenous waste through the gills. So remember, water is constantly flowing over the gills, so it can actually take a bunch of this nitrogenous waste, right from the bloodstream through the gills and out of the fish's body. Now, freshwater fish and saltwater fish have completely different challenges when they're in water. In fact, most freshwater fish, if you put them in the ocean, they will quickly die. And also, the opposite is also true. Most saltwater fish, if you put them in freshwater, they will also die. There's always a few exceptions, but as a general rule. Now, freshwater fish, their problem is that their bodies are saltier than the surrounding water. So water is constantly going inside their bodies. And so they constantly have to pee all the time. They're constantly getting rid of this really dilute, watery urine to kind of regulate how much water is inside their bodies. Saltwater fish, on the other hand, they have the opposite problem. The salt water is actually saltier than their tissues. So they're constantly losing water. So water is essentially being sucked out of them. So think of like when you put salt on a slug or a snail, the reason why it kills that, slug or snail is because the salt just sucks the water right out and it will die. So saltwater fish have the opposite problem. They're constantly losing water, and so they have to drink lots of seawater and then pee out very concentrated urine. So that makes sense. Just like us, when our bodies are under stress and we want to conserve water, our urine will be more concentrated. Whereas if we're drinking tons of water, we have just the opposite. We'll have a very watery urine in order to regulate how much water is in our bodies. So in that sense, we're very similar to fish in a lot of ways. And in fact, we evolved from fish, so that makes total sense. Response. So now we definitely have animals that have what are considered to be brains. Now, when you look at the fish's brain over here, though, again, it does not look anything like a human brain, right? And that is because it is quite different. So compared to invertebrates, they do have a very well-developed nervous system. But when you look at it, the different parts of the brain, so here's the hindbrain, the midbrain, the cerebellum, the forebrain, and then you have the olfactory tract and the olfactory sacs. When you look here, these two bits here, these two giant things here, which make up, I don't know, a third of the brain maybe, are actually devoted to olfactory. And what does olfactory mean? That means smell. So you probably don't think of this. We think of dogs as having a great sense of smell, and there's other animals that have great sense of smell, but fish also have, most of them have a really great sense of smell. They rely on their sense of smell a lot. And so therefore, a large percentage of their brain is devoted to smell. Fish also have something, other senses. They have that we don't have. They have like a sixth sense. And this is called the lateral line system. And so this lateral line system runs down the side of the fish on both sides. Here you see it. It's a little bit less obvious in the shark, but if you look very, very carefully, you can see it. And in most freshwater fish, you can see it very, very readily once you bring them out of the water. Now these fish, the lateral line is made up of lots of little pores or holes in the skin. And these go to this tube that's inside the body, and this tube has different cells. It has cells that are very sensitive to movement, and also cells, in many cases, that are sensitive to electrical charges. So this is why if you disturb the water, the fish will quickly move away, because they can feel that even though they could be quite a distance away. You've also probably heard, if you've ever watched, Shark Week, that sharks can actually detect your beating heart, and that is because the electrical activity that is involved with your heart beating, they can actually sense that. And so if your heart were to speed up, the shark can actually sense that. And in fact, they think that is one of the things that leads them to attack, is if their prey is, if their heart rate increases and they're thrashing around, this could mean that they're injured. And so sharks would much prefer to attack an injured animal than a healthy animal that can fight back. So if you see sharks around, the worst thing you can do is thrash around and make a lot of noise and move a lot. The best thing you can do is just to stay as calm as possible. And of course, when it gets too close, punch it in the face. If you notice here, around the eye here, the lateral line system kind of moves up here. So it's on the sort of nose here and around the eye. And so again, this is very sensitive. So they say if you're attacked by a shark, you punch it in the face, it will often, back off. Also, you can gouge out the eyes. Sharks don't like that either. All right, so movement. So pretty basic. You've all seen fish swim. Of course, what's different than dolphins and whales and other mammals is fish, when they're moving, they're going to move their tails back and forth. All right, of course, fins, as we already mentioned, very important for controlling the movements. Again, like the fins on an airplane or a helicopter. Fish often have a stream-like shape, and they produce mucus. So when you get a fish and you say, "Oh, this fish is slimy," it is slimy. It's producing mucus that sticks to its skin, and this essentially makes the fish able to swim through the water more easily. Because we don't think about it, but if you think for a moment about running on the beach versus running in the water, like up to your waist, let's say, it's much harder to run through the water. The water takes a lot of energy to move through water. So anything the fish can do to reduce drag from the water is going to help them immensely. Another thing that helps fish to move is they have what's called a swim bladder. And this swim bladder is actually filled with gases, or think, like air. And like a submarine, what this does is it can fill up with more gas, or it can have less gas. And what this does, like a submarine, is it helps to make the fish more more buoyant, so they float up higher, or less buoyant, so that they sink down. So not only can fish swim forward and use their fins to move around that way, even if they're completely still, they can use their swim bladder to rise up, to sink down, or to simply stay in the same position in the water column. Reproduction. Okay, so obviously all things have to reproduce. So how do fish reproduce? You probably never gave it much thought. But fish are going to have external fertilization. That is to say that most of them will release sperm and eggs into the water, and they'll meet and fertilize the eggs. So here we see some eggs over here that have been fertilized, and there's little baby fish inside. And in fact, you can see the eyes of the baby fish right here. And when they hatch, here's a hatched baby fish. You see this thing kind of attached to it. And what is this? This is the yolk sac. And so when the fish is inside the egg, and for many fish, a few days or weeks, shortly after they hatch, they have this yolk sac attached, to them. And very much like birds, it does the same thing. It provides nutrients and food while it's growing inside the egg, and in many cases, for the first few days or weeks after it does hatch outside the egg. So this will shrink and get smaller and smaller as the fish grows. And of course, at some point, it's going to have to actually eat something. Now we can divide all three, we can divide all fish into three major groups. We have the oviparous, the ovoviparous, and the viviparous. Now it helps me to remember ovum or ovo means egg. In fact, in humans we call the female's egg the ovum. Vivir in Spanish means to live. So these are live births. So let's talk about the three different types really quick. So the oviparous, this is where, again, there's external fertilization, and the fish gets all its nutrition from the yolk sac. So salmon and many, many other fish, I would say probably most fish, fall into this category. You also have the ovoviviparous. A little tricky. These are actually born live. So in other words, the egg is inside the mother, it hatches inside the mother, and the babies are born, and then they can use that egg yolk for nutrition after they leave the mother's body. And this one's very similar. These are essentially born live. So in other words, again, there's no egg outside the body, but they actually get nourishment from the mother's body, and there's no yolk. So mammals, of course, are very well known for their ability for the babies as they're growing to get their nutrients from the mother. So this is a similar system. It's